In June 2001, Vladimir Putin met George W. Bush in Slovenia. For years, we only knew about Bush's comment, that he looked into Putin's soul. But recently, declassified transcripts show what Putin was actually talking about during that meeting. He was giving Bush a history lecture. He told Bush that the Soviet collapse wasn't a defeat, but a voluntary act of Russian goodwill. He said Russia gave away thousands of square kilometers of territory, including Ukraine and Kazakhstan, just to change the world for the better. This sounds like a weird detail from 20 years ago, but it's actually the key to understanding why Russia is at war today. Putin's obsession isn't just about NATO. He's obsessed with the idea that the Soviet Union didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because Russian leaders made a series of catastrophic mistakes. He thinks Russia was robbed not by the West, but by its own people. If you ask the average person why the Soviet Union fell, they'll give you a standard list. Ronald Reagan's Star Wars outspent them, the Afghan war broke their back, and the system was just too inefficient to survive. It's a clean story. It has a winner and a loser. But when you actually look at the data, that story falls apart. Take the Afghan war. We call it the Soviet Vietnam, implying it bankrupted the empire. In reality, the CIA estimated the war cost the Kremlin about $3 billion a year. That sounds huge, but the total Soviet military budget at the time was over 120 billion. Afghanistan was only 2.5% of their military spending. It was a tragedy and a political embarrassment, but financially, it was a rounding error. It didn't break the bank. The real killer wasn't a war in the desert. It was a series of boring technical mistakes made right in the center of Moscow. Vladislav Zubok describes it as a perfect storm created by a hapless captain. The Soviet Union actually had two different types of money. One was cash for people to buy bread and vodka. The other was non-cash, basically digital accounting credits used by factories to trade with each other. For decades, the state kept a partition between them to prevent inflation. In 1987 and 88, Gorbachev tried to liberalize the economy. He gave factory managers more power and allowed them to create cooperatives. But he didn't realize he was punching holes in that partition. Suddenly, factory bosses were siphoning that massive non-cash pool and turning it into cash to pay themselves or their workers. It was like a financial Niagara Falls. A massive flood of liquid money hit a market that had no goods to buy. This is why the shelves went empty. It wasn't that the factories stopped working, it was that the money became worthless almost overnight because of a technical policy error. Even Chernobyl, the ultimate symbol of Soviet failure, didn't kill the state. It was a massive expense, but the USSR had survived worse. The empire didn't die of old age or military defeat. It died because its leaders opened the freezer of 1960s economic ideas, took out a half-baked plan, and accidentally blew up their own currency. While the West was busy taking credit for winning the Cold War, the Soviet Union was actually busy committing unintentional economic suicide. If you look at most empires in history, they fall because the people on the edges rebel. They want to get away from the center. But the Soviet Union was different. It didn't just fall because Ukraine or the Baltics wanted out. It fell because Russia wanted out. In the late 80s, a strange mood took over Moscow. Russian leaders, the people running the very core of the empire, started thinking they were the victims. Enter Boris Yeltsin. He was the leader of the Russian Republic, but he had a problem. His rival, Mikhail Gorbachev, was the leader of the whole Soviet Union. As long as the Soviet Union existed, Yeltsin was just second in command. Yeltsin realized that to become the undisputed king, he didn't need to fix the empire. He needed to destroy the office Gorbachev was sitting in. He used Russian nationalism as his crowbar. Yeltsin's team pushed a narrative that sounds familiar today. Russia first. They convinced the public that Russia was the milk cow of the USSR. They argued that Russia's vast oil and gas wealth was being trained to pay for schools in Central Asia and factories in the Caucasus. They thought that if they cut ties with the other 14 republics, Russia would become an overnight economic superpower. They weren't trying to save the world, they were trying to save the budget. In December 1991, Yeltsin met with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus in a hunting lodge. Without a single shot being fired, they signed a paper saying the Soviet Union simply ceased to exist. They didn't consult the other republics, they didn't have a referendum. They just turned off the lights and went home. Yeltsin got his wish. He was the president of an independent Russia, and Gorbachev was a man without a country. But here's the catch. They wanted the independence, but they didn't realize they were losing the territory. They thought that even if the USSR was gone, Russia would still be the big brother that everyone had to listen to. They chose a nation over an empire because they thought it would make them richer. Today, Putin calls this a geopolitical catastrophe, but he rarely mentions that it was his own mentors and the Russian elites in Moscow who actually signed the death warrant. This is where the story of 1991 becomes the war of today. When those Russian leaders dissolved the Union, they assumed that the internal, administrative borders drawn by the Bolsheviks would just stay the same. They didn't think it mattered much, because they expected to keep a common space with Ukraine. But for Putin, those borders were the original mistake. This is why he spends so much time in his speeches attacking Lenin. Putin argues that in 1922, the early communists robbed Russia. He claims they took historically Russian lands, like the Donbas and the Crimean Peninsula, and handed them to a newly created Ukrainian republic just to buy the loyalty of local elites. To him, the Soviet Union was a time bomb, because it gave these republics a legal right to leave, taking Russian gifts with them. This isn't a new idea he came up with recently. It goes back to his mentor, Anatoly Sobchak, the former mayor of St. Petersburg. As early as 1992, Sobchak was on Russian television warning that if Ukraine left the Union, it couldn't just take the 1922 borders with it. He argued that if they wanted to be a separate country, they should return to the borders they had before they joined Russia centuries ago. This is the logic behind the current invasion. In Putin's mind, he isn't invading a foreign country. He is reclaiming property that was lost in a bad divorce. He views the 1991 collapse not as a triumph of democracy, but as a moment where Russia was cheated, not by the Americans, but by its own internal mapmakers. He's trying to fix the mistake of the nationalists we talked about in the last section. Those leaders in 1991 thought they could have a wealthy, independent Russia without the burden of the empire. Putin has realized that you can't have the empire's influence without the empire's land. He's essentially trying to hit undo on a choice Russia made 30 years ago. This brings us back to that room in Slovenia in 2001. When Putin told George W. Bush that Russia's goodwill changed the world, he wasn't just making small talk. He was setting a price tag. In Putin's mind, Russia did something no other empire in history had ever done. It chose to dismantle itself peacefully. It didn't fight a civil war to keep Ukraine or Kazakhstan. It just walked away. The tragedy of the last 30 years is that the West and Russia read that event in two completely different ways. The West saw a defeated enemy. We thought we won the Cold War, so we felt we had the right to expand NATO and rewrite the rules of Europe. But Putin saw a voluntary sacrifice. He expected the West to treat Russia as a retired partner, with a zone of influence and a seat at the table. When that didn't happen, the goodwill turned into a grievance. Putin's war in Ukraine is his way of demanding payment for a gift he thinks the West stole. He is trying to reclaim the thousands of square kilometers he mentioned to Bush. But the real irony is that he isn't just fighting NATO. He's fighting the ghost of the Russian nationalism. He's trying to use force to fix a problem that was created by Russian pens and paper in a hunting lodge 30 years ago. The Soviet Union didn't fall because it was beaten. It fell because Russia thought it would be better off alone. Now, decades later, they've changed their mind, and the rest of the world is having to live through the consequences of that regret. It's easy to get lost in Putin's history lectures. If you look at the world through his eyes, everything seems like a mistake that needs correcting, but there's a massive logical flaw in his voluntary gift argument. You cannot treat an empire like a retail purchase that has a 30-year return policy. When Russia chose to leave the Soviet Union in 1991, it wasn't just an elite power struggle in a hunting lodge. It was a legal divorce that was ratified by millions of people. In Ukraine, over 90% of the population voted for independence, including a majority in the very regions, like Crimea and the Donbas, that Putin is fighting over today. Russia didn't just give these lands away, it signed international treaties recognizing them as sovereign territory. In 1994, Russia signed the Budapest Memorandum. In exchange for Ukraine giving up the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, weapons that were on its soil, Russia explicitly promised to respect Ukraine's existing borders. You can't argue that the collapse was a voluntary gift, while simultaneously trying to take back the gift with tanks. Once you recognize a country's independence, to get them to disarm, you lose the right to say their borders are fake 30 years later. The hard truth that Putin's narrative ignores is that time moves forward. Generations of people in Ukraine, Kazakhstan and the Baltics have grown up knowing nothing but independence. To them, the Bolshevik mistakes of 1922 are ancient history. They aren't historically Russian people living in a mistake. They are citizens of their own countries living in the present. Putin is trying to use 18th century logic in a 21st century world. He wants the prestige of the voluntary sacrifice he described to Bush, but he also wants the territory he surrendered to get that prestige. But history doesn't work that way. Russia chose the path of the nation-state in 1991 because it thought it would be richer and freer. You can't spend 30 years as a sovereign nation and then decide you want to be an empire again just because the deal didn't turn out exactly how you wanted.